I'm so glad you could all join us this evening. As you know, the subject is tapping into the true power of prayer. And I must say, this has been an extremely challenging, very rewarding period for me, diving into the subject for the last few weeks, meditating on it, researching on it, discovering what other people think about it, asking myself some very difficult questions. And in my own journey, I've been basically preparing myself to speak on the subject. I had a little bit of a cathartic, highly personal experience with prayer itself, which I will speak to and give credence towards the end. So it's quite a fascinating subject for me. And I must admit that something that I realized right at the start is that as what I would call myself is more of a spiritual person, as a shamanic practitioner, the idea of prayer immediately gives me, in my own labeling, my own wound, it gives me a little bit of an immature feel to it, like that it is something that is just for religion. And I think it's a very, very fascinating rabbit hole. So come and join me. And like with all things, when I do a talk, I invite you to simply use what has value for you. If something challenges you, but you find you might have value in what's being challenged, then I invite you to just, for this short while, drop your concepts of knowing, drop your ideas of what you are certain of, and just allow yourself to go into, I guess you could call it a semi-plastic state, and just allow yourself to relinquish that knowing for a short while. And you can always pick up those ideals and those concepts at the end if you're sure that they are serving you. It's such a beautiful process. I think it was Socrates who spoke about that a truly educated man is someone who can pick something up and mull it in his mind, no matter how bizarre what's been said to him is. And I absolutely love that, and I try and use that in all the things that I do, or when I receive information from other people, and I listen to some beautiful people speak on some very special subjects. So shall we begin? Mm-hmm. You know, as long as man has existed, one would imagine that he was aware of the fact that he was part of a pattern of life, a pattern of existence, far greater than he could understand. But you can imagine as he stood and he watched the sunrise and the sunsets, and he observed birth and death, and I guess what I would call the immutables, the things that are set in stone, part of this mighty pattern of life. And one can imagine that knowing that part of our makeup is this inner voice, we can just imagine how many conversations man has had on the inside of his physical vehicle over the periods of from antiquity until now. And what's a fascinating thing is we see in history there's definitely this development of man as he evolves in his prefrontal cortex, and he gets this sense of what we call intelligence, this evolution that we feel has taken place, which I think we'll challenge to a degree. This idea starts to permeate through the little history that we do have, but it's very ingrained. It's pretty hard to challenge the idea that we start to develop this idea that we need to conquer our surroundings. We even have sayings, we say things like, we've got to conquer nature and we've got to survive. And there really is this idea of man versus the environment, man versus earth, man versus the savage beasts, as though he was the separate thing. And it's a fascinating conversation because of this domination of man's environment, this domination of everything that man experiences and observes as outside of himself. is very much part of a conversation of prayer. And how would that be? Well, we'll see. We'll get there. But I want you to consider that in this domination, we learn to harness the elements and turn them into tools and become better killers and harvest with far greater effectiveness. And as our ability to harness energy and food improved, then the size of our communities grew. And we were able to create towns and cities, and absolutely fascinating. But what's really interesting about this whole thing is that one could call this was our evolution of our intelligence. We were making breakthroughs. And it has, I would think it's been appearing to man for thousands of years that we are always on the cusp of making this absolutely magnificent breakthrough. That it's going to happen at any moment. That breakthrough that actually just makes it so easy to be a human being. And yet that is not what has happened. How curious. If anything, one could say that these evolutions that have taken place, these breakthroughs, these scientific ideas, the reductionism, the searching smaller and smaller into the particles to see what things are made of, and creating this mechanistic, almost like this billiard ball perspective of how the universe works. One ball knocks the other. Even when I went to school, they were still teaching it. They've kind of got rid of it now, but I think that consciousness is so permeated in us that we are part of a machine, a mechanistic thing where one thing happens and then another thing happens. And we believe that atoms were these building blocks and that we could observe the way they bumped against each other and reacted, and alchemical transformations and mixings and compounds, and really in this supposed birth of this intelligence and the sciences and this mechanistic view, this billiard ball or snooker version of reality, even seeing yourself as a mechanism. A really, really interesting thing happens in this whole process is one has to ask yourself, has it made it easier to be a human being? Because as we've gone, I think that I would say that from my perspective, and I think from many, many philosophers, is we have this idea that the environment is excluded from us. We have an inner reality which we have labeled as who we think we are, the thoughts I am feeling in here that appear to be separate to those outside of me, and the emotions that I'm feeling in here. And man essentially has gone on this mighty rampage, only in the history that I'm aware of. And who knows what happened the 50,000 years before. But it's gone on this rampage to almost, as we learn to dominate our environment, to understand our environment more and more through this materialistic and this reductionism of reducing things to their finer parts. And yet, a rise in the inner pressures of man is being recorded. One could say that the neuroses of the human mind are on the rise. The emotional instabilities of the human beings are on the rise. The inner pressures are what we're going to call it for this conversation. So it's almost like in trying to control the external environment, we have actually not come anywhere at all regarding what our actual experience of life is. One would have thought as we built these romantic versions of reality like malls and easier to get water and things like that. I mean, sure, there's no doubt that it has made our quality of external life so much easier. But if that is the case, one has to really ask yourself deeply, in this age of luxury, this age of science, it's almost like we've evolved all the secondary matters of the world. That's a good way of putting it. All the secondary things have been solved, food and housing, and we've got so complex in those areas. And there's this massive elephant in the room that just seems to be not addressed. And the more we're moving into this mechanistic reductionism, billiard ball view of the universe, the more we are allowing it to be normal to not speak about the inner state, the inner struggle. I mean, man, essentially, according to nearly every philosopher and every religion that ever was birthed, man's environment is a result of the constant outpouring of the inner dialogues and feelings of man. So man is inextricably linked to his environment. I once remember the great philosopher Alan Watts saying that the only reason you have an inner world is because the other half of you is the outside world, and they balance against each other. You know there is an outside because you have an inside. So this argument of where the separation would come into is not one that we really get to address. But the possibility of the fact that man essentially has allowed this conversation in this modern time of things such as prayer and the words and the wars that go inside our minds and the schism of the different opinions and thoughts that we all are fighting within us. And it's an incredible thing, because why would I start with this conversation? Because when we approach something, this ancient thing of prayer, this idea of being able to bridge the gap between yourself and some greater pattern of purpose, the first thing that we tend to do in the modern world is we approach the subject with domination, which is a very, very fascinating subject, because no one can say how it should be done and no one can say what is wrong and right. But the conversation that at hand is to kind of really challenge ourselves about this question of why it is that we feel the need to dominate. Now, I think there's a pretty easy answer. I could talk from personal experience. I have an identity that I have built since I was born, and this identity is important to me. I have these ideas of what I like and what I don't like. I've built a framework of what is good and what is bad. And I've also built a network of concepts and people and things that I deeply love and I care for. And if any of those things, my identity or the people I care for, are affected in any way of what I would consider negatively, from being ill to accidents to, then I immediately feel my own will rising, wanting to close my eyes in prayer and to ask for another version of domination of what is unfolding, of changing, almost like approaching the deity's feet to pick my side on all that is unfolding. Whereas, you know, if you think about it, there have been a set of mystics right through the ages in every country across the world that had this amazing concept, of this amazing idea. And their idea was simply that in their practice, that the true power of prayer actually lay in the surrendering. What a fascinating idea, that not to try and dominate that which was what was going on, but that what they were calling for in prayer was the power of acceptance, that true peace could be found in drawing strength to strength and vision and faith to be able to deal and see and feel and accept the absolute perfection of that which is unfolding in your life, as painful as the whole thing might seem from your separate identity, from the way that we perceive ourselves as a separate inner world, completely contrast to all other things. And we have this idea when we pray in modern times, we have this idea that it is to will the domination, to beg for something to be different other than what it is. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm sure that thousands of people, millions of people have spent millions of hours doing that. But the real question that we're asking is the difficult question of what is the true power of prayer? Do we feel in our experience of prayer and our own spirituality, do we personally feel that if you pray hard enough, this aspect of you, this little voice in your head, that suddenly what will happen is that your side amongst all the sides, because there's always sides, will be chosen simply because you have asked? Or are we able to identify the possibility that it is a misunderstanding of how absolutely perfect and vast this pattern of life that we are part of, that is such an enigma to us, actually is? And perhaps the mystics were completely correct in the fact that they went in there to surrender. And that's a conversation that we will continue to have. I do think that it is very fair to say, though, that we have grossly misunderestimated just how much our environments, our governments, our politics, our laws, our state of health has to do with the outpouring of the inner worlds into the outer. And therefore, a conversation like this about what is going on inside the inner worlds and what is the interface that we can set up as a bridge, because it could be one of the greatest conversations we could possibly have in our lives. So let's continue to dive down this rabbit hole. I think if we are willing to entertain the possibility in our spectrum of understanding that our inner world, our thoughts, our feelings, this place that we think is so secret and hidden, has far more to do with the state of the world than we think, then the dialogue has truly, truly been opened. You know, I talk about the inner pressures, and it's my way of communicating without attaching to some religion or doctrine or even psychology. But the inner pressures, if you actually speak to people, are enormous. And I think these inner pressures could be called anxieties and fears, doubt, loneliness, tragedy, trauma, and mental illness. A lot of it is essentially the realm of suffering. And there is no doubt that there is an external round of suffering. And what I mean by that is out in the world, you see people dying of starvation, and you see people that are victims to violence. But essentially, most of the great writers, great poets, great musicians, great sages of the age, and perhaps even yourself, will attest to the fact that the greatest suffering is the suffering that happens on the inner world of whatever the self is that you are experiencing. And hopefully, in this lifetime, if there is more than one, hopefully you have been blessed to not have to know just how dark the state of the inner world can get without correct maintenance and housekeeping. And that's not even to attest that it is necessarily a person's fault. So where that leaves us is I'm simply suggesting that this conversation about what is going on this inner dialogue and this way that we could relate to this greater purpose pattern or primordial whatever you want to call it, prime creator, would be such an important conversation. You know, the one thing that can be said for religion, if we look at this conversation of the antiquities that have come before us, is that one thing you can say in religion is that in religion, at least, there was this idea that man should first correct himself And in correcting himself, he would bring what he could into the world. There was this constant stage of attempting to self-correct. And I'm not going to get into a philosophical debate about the fact that that was in many ways manipulated. And yes, there was a system of domination and control. But essentially, we must not disconnect from just how many thousands of really earnest individuals there have been in history that have closed their eyes and have begged to understand the virtues of man and have begged to understand the pattern of essential suffering that man began to experience the more he perceived himself as separate. And in our fear, as we discussed, our need to dominate. So what's very fascinating about this whole thing is that many, many people in this great spiritual awakening that's been happening on earth, and that's, I like to say, that's an opinion, that's not necessarily a fact, that is a concept. But from my perspective, I would say there's been this great awakening happening on earth. And the fascinating thing about that is that many people in their lifetimes, perhaps some of you even sitting in this room with me now, would attest to the fact that they got to a certain point where the block of what they were experiencing and expanding into, their religion, their box, their belief system, it became too cramped for them. They were no longer able to get, I guess one could almost call it the relief and the safety and the essence of faith that they used to. And many, such as myself, walked away and rejected religion on a very, very deep level. And essentially, a lot of people, along with religion, rejected prayer itself, the inner dialogue. What's fascinating about this is this original rejection, what I call it in coaching, and also I've identified it very strong in myself, is a lot of people had religion forced on them when they were younger. And I call this the rebel wound. And you know what's fascinating is that a really large portion of atheists, according to statistics, are highly intelligent individuals. And what essentially happens to many of us is that we create this huge rebel wound where the version of how it is that I, as a neural system, interconnect with this greater purpose pattern and universe that is so clear to see, but not clear to understand how exactly it intermingles. That's really the conversation at hand. That you feel so angry and so lied to and so frustrated by these rehearsed answers that you're given, that instead of just rejecting their answer of this greater purpose pattern or interactions that we have with this quantum basement of reality, we reject it all. And essentially we walk away completely closed to the inner conversation. So it's essentially like someone spoke shit to me and tried to convince me of such nonsense regarding spirit that I completely rejected this thing, going into what I call the rebel wound. And many people that I have coached over the years, I get to the point where they think that they are having an absolute tragedy regarding certain things. But what I notice is essentially in this search for purpose and search for something greater, they are actually burning to re-find God in a new definition, in a new perspective. Every single man actually holds, whether they admit it or not, that same feeling of knowing that they're actually part of something greater. So this rebel wound can be quite a dangerous thing in our lives, because often it means we throw the baby out with the bathwater. And sometimes it can take us an entire lifetime to revisit the conversation. And as I said, prayer is one of the things that get thrown out. And the result of this, because this is happening on a global scale in many cultures and many religions, is that we are speaking less and less about the inner dialogue, less and less about things such as prayer, And where prayer does exist is just the system of we teaching our children to close their eyes and to dominate the spiritual space, to tell what you want, to tell what you need changed, all from without asking the question of who's asking, who are you asking, what is your role in what you're asking. Could it be that this part of you is misinformed? It's a really, really big conversation. What is the relationship of your inner and outer worlds? Could they be of one? Could what you observe around you be the other half of you? And what you experience on the inside of you be its matching contrast? These are questions that we can only ask ourselves. But what is very clear to me, which I feel is even beyond the realm of concept, is that we are part of immutable processes. The ocean, every day when I'm on the ocean, she comes in and she goes out. And I can just imagine how many creatures, how many trillions of organisms and mollusks and shells and sharks are having this experience of that wave pulling in and pushing out. And this is a purpose pattern that unless you actually step back away from the ocean and watch, you don't realize just how immutable it is, how set in stone it is. And yet so many creatures within this process of the drawing back of the water have full experiences completely different to the creature next to them. But what doesn't change is that water draws in and draws out. And of course, I'm using this as an analogy, but the sun rises and the sun sets completely regardless of your opinion of it. The cycles of birth and death not only exist in the actual biological transmutation of things, as in the ending of their lives, but if you start to really go into the inquiry of your life, you will notice that everything is a pattern, whether it is a pattern of negativity that is torturing you, or whether it is a pattern of noticing that you do certain things over and over, or, you know, we have this beautiful saying about the fact that we really can see things in hindsight. And it's so true, because a huge part of our brain is actually available to us for pattern recognition. And it's an incredible thing when we start to realize. But these patterns exist so powerfully. I mean, if you look at geometry and mathematics, how people can think that the universe is completely expressing without intelligence, I find absolutely fascinating. There's mathematical perfections in everything from the way a flower emanates to the way that the very universe moves. I find that absolutely incredible. I mean, if you even track the way the planets move together over a period, it makes these beautiful, beautiful shapes and sacred geometry symbols. So this is a really fascinating thing of this great pattern that's unfolding. And really, where that leaves man is, for thousands of years, one would imagine, standing, staring up at the stars and at the sun, which is how I could imagine one of the reasons why they became some of the earliest symbols to our, what one could call deities or godlike statuses or things that we pray to or revere. And being part of this purpose pattern is an incredible thing, because you imagine even yourself in this modern day sitting on a beach, and perhaps you have cancer, perhaps you are dying, perhaps you have lost someone in an accident, perhaps you have a deformity, a limb missing, or a mental deformity, or some great thing that is in your life that you are really battling to accept. And I think that man has asked these same questions so deeply. Is it to rage against it? Is it to accept it? Is it to beg for the will that you hold and the perspective you hold now? Or is it to surrender in absolute acceptance, to ask the divine for the strength to let go, to surrender, and to acknowledge something that I think that only the mystics have been able to up until now, that it is simply me that does not know exactly why this is perfect. I think his name was Paul the Venetian, one of the great saints. I might have that wrong, but what I do remember, whichever saint it was, he used to go to bed at night and he used to pray next to his candle. And he used to say, not my will, not my will, not my will, but thy will be done. Not my will, not my will, not my will, but thy will be done. He used to chant this over and over, and I find that such an incredible thing. It's almost like saying, I am part of this massive, immutable cycle. I get to think about it. I get to see it from perspectives. That I am part of this thing unfolding. It's almost asking for the wisdom to understand why it is that you have created what you have and what it is that you are part of unfolding. And I think it's honestly only this reductionist, materialistic perspective of a mind that we have created that is so born in separation, that has a very clear idea of how things should be and how things should go. So that still leaves us very deep in this conversation for yourself so far. When you close your eyes, do you go into dominate? Do you go into tell? Do you go into assert? Do you go into will? Or do you feel that what you do is go into hear, go into ask, go into surrender, go into accept? It is certainly a question to ask yourself next time you are in silence or in tragedy. It's incredible how quickly our inner dialogue comes alive when we find ourselves amidst a really, really deep, dark night of the soul. There have been many great minds that have essentially spoken. One could even call it an observation, because I don't even think it is conceptual, that the only thing that you can be sure of is absolute change, constant. Things are birthing and dying, whether they are thoughts or whether they are patterns of behaviors or whether they are biological or geological manifestations. They are constantly being birthed and dying, pulling in, pulling back, rising, setting, decaying, springing forth. And it's essentially, when we think about suffering, I think it was Gautama Buddha who said that most of our suffering comes from resistance. It's quite an amazing thing to consider, that the more you resist something, the more you suffer to it. And I think that really comes into this conversation of what it is after this conversation you are going to do next time you kneel, next time you clasp your hands, next time you ask for help. What is the maturity, the love and the clarity that we can bring to the conversation? Because I'm sure you have noticed, I have certainly not for a moment tried to convince you of the fact that there is something greater on, greater to communicate. To me, it is the most obvious thing in the universe. It is not something of my mind. If you look at an acorn and you meditate on an acorn and you consider the fact that that acorn is going to become a massive oak tree, which is made up of millions of organisms, bacteria, creatures, microbes. And on top of that, it's going to be deep in the earth and it's going to be reaching to the sky. So it will be in the darkness. And it will also be touching the light on its leaves, the higher heaven realms, and all the creatures that are going to be living inside that tree. And then you come back to the acorn, and you look at the acorn, you cannot tell me that it's an accident that the tree comes out of the acorn. The acorn implies intelligence. And that acorn to me is the building block of all things, whether you want to call it your cell, whether you want to call it an atom, which we now know is not immutable. It is actually this weird thing that sometimes exists and sometimes doesn't. At the basement of reality, there's almost nothing there but potential energy. So back to the acorn, I want you to consider that when you're holding an acorn, a simplistic version would be like, do you know somehow if these things bump around together that they'll create, somehow they created an acorn tree? Nonsense. The intelligence inside an acorn is implied. The intelligence inside you, the thoughts and the feelings and the struggles and everything that you're having is implied. I mean, I would go as far as to say that if you think that there is a Big Bang, has it ever occurred to you that you're part of it right now? Everything burst into existence in this reality that we know of and is expanding. And right now, as you are seated at home, you are part of the Big Bang. You are part of consciousness currently opening and unfolding and questioning and self-actualizing. And why is it that we think it is something that happened? This is this mechanistic possession that we have in our minds that we're convinced we're part of some sort of pinball-like machine. So if you could just entertain for a moment that that acorn has intelligence implied in it. The acorn tree is going to happen. But there are so many things that could happen in the opening of the acorn tree, but it's implied. Don't know exactly how big the acorn tree will be. I don't know exactly what's going to be living in the acorn tree. I don't know if the acorn tree will live for hundreds of years or if it will live for a short span. But to think that the building blocks of what it is that you are is accidental is almost the boggling of the mind. So knowing that this divine deity, light or presence emanates and exists within you, knowing that the longing that you feel to solve these great enigmas and mysteries, this burning desire that you have to touch deeper into the core frequency of love, the basement of reality, that all comes from the fact that you are part of something so much greater than you realize. And of course, what this leaves us with is, if we were to really, really go into the clarity of what the conversation of prayer could be about, is we essentially are bringing a really big level of responsibility into the space now, because we're basically saying that the outer stability exists because of the inner stability. I mean, because of the lack of inner stability. And that the more, even in your own personal space, you can solve this conundrum of how it is best for you to approach prayer, to create commune and safety within your own vessel, to reclaim the house of your own inner being, to repossess your own mind, and to reopen your own heart, how much the external environment changes and reacts to that. And this is an inner war. This is a war that has been written about in every poem and every song. It is so disgusting. I mean, just think about for yourself. Just think about this conversation. Think about the wars that you have fought inside you, wanting to know, the need to understand. Sure, the need to understand. And as we said, there is no greater moment. Potentially, one could even go that perhaps that is the plan in the first place, when suffering or these birth and death cycles leave this part of us that contemplates and thinks separately from the whole, leaves us in such a dark night of the soul, in this crisis, that we begin to ask such huge questions that all we can really do is begin in almost madness, as though suffering gives us no option. And we tend to suffer when something is awry. And it gives us no option to begin to make the big questions and the great inquiries. And that great inquiry for any searcher always begins within. And that search essentially starts with conversations like, what voice is this that speaks or begs in prayer? Who am I when I'm thinking? Is the voice inside me or voices? Is that who I am? Am I meant to rage against it inside? And essentially most of our psychological neuroses or sufferings, from OCD to anxiety disorder to epilepsy to so many of them, can be attributed to this inner pressure of man, unaddressed fears, unanswered questions, allowing guess you could say, the imagination to absolutely run wild regarding our fears and thoughts of what will happen when we die, and what will happen if I lose this thing. And yeah, the inner pressures are allowing neuroses to run mad. And perhaps you're one of those people that is coming to this room wondering how you can find some gentle solace in what seems to be a hard, cold world to some at certain periods. How will you find this gentle place? In speaking, as we have, about almost how the suffering or this desperation can lead us to begin to ask the really big questions. I know that some philosophers believe that your soul, if it does not feel like it's getting to shine through and you are too possessed by the mind, that your soul will literally walk you into a crisis to the point where you have to question everything. There's the proverbial eye of the needle that you go through, where all illusions are torn asunder, where the flesh of idolatry is torn from your bones until you find the substance that you are made of. What that means to me in my journey regarding prayer is, it's had to really make me wonder, what am I? What is this voice that I hear? And it's a fascinating conversation, because if we were to bring meditation, which would be more of what one could call an Eastern perspective on the prayer conversation, although a slightly different energy, the one thing that you see at the heart of a lot of Eastern philosophy is that they essentially are trying to clear. They are essentially trying to identify that mind is not real, as in not the real version of them. And that's very conceptual, but I can tell you in my own personal life, I feel even now in my life that I'm a bit of a war inside, a bit of a war with my own mind. And when I am in a healthy relationship with what I think is going on regarding the correlation between my inner world and my outer world, my inner pressures are so much, I would say, stable, so much more stable, and my anxieties and all those things subside. We've also moved into an era where our primal essence is extremely subverted, to the point where we don't dance and shout and express and move, and there is a lot of holding in going on, and there is a lot of suppression of nature, and our concepts and our ideas just get greater and greater of how it is we think we should behave. And I think that essentially this is causing a little bit of an inner pressure cooker of note. And what this really leaves you with is, there's got this voice in your head that you perhaps have realized for yourself is not really you. And it seems to be like a little bit of a radio station that plays inside everybody's head. And what's really interesting is, if you were to imagine yourself in a car, and you were listening to music, you don't necessarily take responsibility for the music that is playing, do you? Because what you do is you realize that there is a receptor, and the receptor is linked into a greater pattern, a greater life kind of unfolding purpose, which would be the radio station and the antennas. And you yourself, what you notice is that you can turn up the songs that you really love. If you want to keep turning it up on the sad songs, you can. You can drive home and get yourself, without even changing radio station, quite sad. And you could also turn up the rock bits or the very motivational bits. And I feel like thoughts is very, very similar. Without going too deeply into it, I feel like thoughts in my head are the same. I also, once I have begun to embrace the perfection of pattern and how pattern is literally the expression of the divine, because it is in absolutely everything. And what's fascinating about that is you start to notice the patterns of your own thoughts and your own emotions and how you can engage with them. A thought is just a thought until it is given your energy, it is believed, it is bought into, and then birthed perhaps through word or action into the outside world. Up until then, it's just something that you're tuning into. And who knows, through prayer with this beautiful antenna that you are, how many levels or stations of reality that you can actually plug into to listen to. What this really comes down to, though, is this very, very difficult conversation. And it comes down to what is the difference between your will and God's will. And it's a fascinating thing because I know many people, I mean, if we look, for instance, an example, and I'm using them as an example simply because I grew up as a Catholic and as a Christian. So I feel perfectly safe to be able to talk about it because it's been part of my life. So I feel like I speak from the inside. There's this very clear idea of the fact that we say things in Christianity like, I'm doing God's work, like as though that person knows what God wants. And they say things like, this is what God wants you to do, what God wants you to know. And it's a really fascinating thing because you see it in all forms of spirituality. You even see it in shamanism. You see this idea of people making a decision about what they feel the truth of this ancient enigma is. In other words, how they, in case I'm losing you, they make a decision about how their internal interface relates to this divine expression, as though perhaps they have some form of a very unique, in their perspective, ticket to this conversation. And I then call this the birth of the spiritual ego. And it's an incredible thing because if you've ever watched someone trying to save people, I'm not even going to say good or bad. I'm just going to say, think about the word. I'm saving you. That's a very, very interesting thing. And I could jump into so many religions. I'm not talking against the religion. I am now at a place where I can go into a Christian church for the first time in my life and have absolute value, close my eyes and really just worship with them. But that was a long route to work through my rebel wound and to kind of allow my mind to look at all the things that they're doing. But what's important is, I hope what you're picking up is, I'm trying to say, what is the difference between your will and God's will? When is it you are possessed by your spiritual ego and allowing it to hijack you? I know, for instance, like in our organization, we hold this idea that everybody has a direct link to the divine and that we trust that they are able to communicate and that we do not need to almost what I feel is an intrusion to intrude into people, to tell them what has been said and what should, to trust the fact that only a person can know what is true, perfect and beautiful for them from their own inner guidance. I mean, at the end of the day, what I'm saying is that, like, we've been talking for 40 minutes about the mystery of it all. There's just such a mystery to it. And if you surrender into that mystery and you feel that mystery. It is so difficult to tell other people how that mystery is for them. So the spiritual ego is a fascinating thing. I would almost say that it is rampant. And it is quite conceptual. But the spiritual ego is quite rampant because, what we do is if we, anybody that studies the mind starts to use certain terms and things because it's the only way we can explain things to each other. But one of those things is that the mind looks for identity. Pain looks for identity. It's temporary, so it wants an identity. It wants to build a story around it. And what's fascinating is I feel like spirituality is no different. I have observed I'm going to give it almost like an animated perspective of what I've observed is a person starting and they get to glimpse some form of, whether it is through trance or prayer or religion or some ancient practice or some psychedelic or whatever it is, and they have this absolutely rapturous experience where they begin to go back online again and remember this receptor that they are and this greater thing that they're part of, they can just bask in and glimpse. And so once that experience happens, that experience actually happens beyond ideas and thoughts and concepts and understanding. There is just an absolute knowing, whether the person was in church or whether you were a drug addict and you were absolutely at that breaking point and you had this breakthrough or this realization, or the most important thing to realize is that when you did do that connection, I want you to think about when this rapturous experience was for you. If you've been blessed to broken through in that way, to just really felt held in the safety of God's love, whatever that is to you, because that is just a word. And what's really, really interesting about that is you realize that there was no belief needed. There was no concept needed. It was a true experiential moment. And what's really, really interesting, why I think prayer is essentially dying, is because we have allowed spiritual ego to hijack. Very often when people speak to me about what it is they're doing, their chakras are doing this and that, and they from this planet, and they are actually clearing the levels of darkness here. It doesn't matter what story it is, and I've been part and privy to many, and I want you to know that many of the stories make perfect sense to me. I'm not mocking that. I'm not mocking anyone. It's not in my nature. I'm mocking concepts. Because what I essentially have seen is the spiritual ego goes, there's a very famous story about Krishnamurti, and he talks about spending the day with the devil and watching, and he walks with the devil and they're following this guy who stops and picks up a little piece of the truth. So he says to the devil, you must be a bit pissed off about this. And the devil goes, They keep walking and he keeps picking up more pieces of truth. And what's fascinating, eventually says to the devil, why do you look so excited? Look how many pieces of truth this guy's picked up. The devil goes, oh, this is how it works. Now we help him organize it. And I found that quite a profound story, because what I have observed is once you have opened, or I have, or because I have been part and am part of the spiritual ego. I am not separate to anything that I discuss in these conversations. It is something I'm experiencing too. Once you have opened this doorway, the spiritual ego gets involved, and it almost goes, okay, well, there's that experience, part of that absolute mysticism. There's an enigma no one's ever been able to solve it. You will never ever, just like the ancient books say in Hebrew and in many, many religions, you will never ever be able to explain the one. You will never be able to name the one. That all things are just like a reflection of the one, but you will never actually be able to make it tangible for even a moment. And the ego goes, oh, no, watch me. I can do this. And the ego builds and builds and builds, and it builds what becomes known, well, to me, your spiritual ego. And your spiritual ego has all these concepts. And the thing is, when I'm talking to these people, or when I close my eyes and I go into prayer, the first thing that really, really trapped me for a long time is for me to realize I am not a concept. It's a really, really important thing. I feel like concepts and ideas, even if they are things you are so absolutely convinced are true, I think that the most powerful thing we can do in tapping into the true power of prayer is to admit that we actually don't know, that actually it just fits and it makes sense. And there's a lot of other people that agree with a similar thing, but it's just a concept. It makes me think of, I think it was David in the Bible. It was said that when he would arrive at the temple to go and pray at the feet of the Lord, that as a king, he would have to remove every garment until he was completely, I don't think he was naked in the story, but completely stripped of all the ostentatious means. And I think it's really symbolic, essentially, of the spiritual ego, that even as a king. And what happens is, I don't know if this is triggering you, but I am so aware of it around myself. I'm aware of it around other people, is spiritual people's stories are getting so big that they almost can't fit two people of different stories into the same room. The one is so convinced that it's light against dark, and then the other group is so sure that it's all about transcending polarity. Some people are convinced that, like essentially what is going on here is that we are under domination and control, and we've got to fight externally as in a form of activism. And some people believe that you have to completely access external change through the inner bodies. But what is really, really extreme is to realize that if we go back to that original rapturous experience, or go back to that moment that you felt truly held by the divine, you will realize that you were free of thoughts and free of concepts. You did not enter some formula into some magic door full of numbers and ideas and get it just right, and next thing you were locked through. It was your sincere surrender into the arms of this greater pattern of purpose and love and evolution. And it's an incredible thing to realize, because when you realize that perhaps one of the things that is preventing you from going deeper and deeper into the doorway of yourself, into the safety and this place of absolute love and acceptance of no matter what, even while your very body might be degrading in the outer world, there is a place that you can enter that is a harbor of safety that will always exist for eternity for you, that is much written about. But one cannot fit through there. The camel cannot fit through there if it is adorned with bags. The concepts, the ideas, the spiritual wisdoms that are thick with linguistics, they cannot fit through this door. And it is only when we truly allow ourselves to admit that our spiritual stories and ideas have become like badges of honor, courses and ideals and abilities, and come like badges of honor that almost like lost generals we put on our shirts as we increase the spiritual ego. I mean, if the spiritual ego didn't exist, how do you explain essentially that these beautiful spiritual communities, you can't put their leaders in the same room? Why are we not all working together? Why are we not? Because spiritual egos. You expand around people that hold a similar frequency, and you feel safe because they have that ideal concept. I mean, essentially, I feel that once you make yourself humble, and this is, I feel, and it's not something that I feel is something I need to prove. It is a feeling for me that once you've made yourself completely humbled on your knees in surrendering to this beautiful thing unfolding, you become less opinionated. How is it that we have taken some strange turn in this awakening that people have become so opinionated that essentially are exhausting. And that are arguing all the time. How do you argue about things that are intangible? Things that have never ever in the history of words been able to be remotely grasped. We convinced that our concepts are a little bit better. If anything, I would say that archetypes are really important. It helps me to understand that I have a negative side and a light side. It helps me to understand that there might be a chakra system, that there is a chakra system, that there's some symbology of a chakra system that's firing within me that holds certain archetypes. And this is really, really powerful. I mean, in psychology, there's a reason why psychology was birthed. It was because of these inner pressures that were growing. And unfortunately, psychology, in my opinion, is a lost art. It's a fallen art. And main reason for that is simply because I'm hoping it gets back on track. But psychology was created to try and resolve these inner pressures and neuroses, and it was on the wrong track very, very quickly, simply for the reason that there is a few ideas that permeate through this modern science. And the first thing is this mechanistic idea that almost like we are put together like parts once again. And this idea that you can help someone without them really being completely actively involved in their own liberation. But at least it is a way that we are still accessing the modern dialogue. At least it is allowing many of us to take a look at what it is that we are birthing from our inner state into the external. But it does leave that one aspect. It leaves us seated so lonely inside ourselves, not willing to let go and surrender ourselves into the arms of something greater. So this spiritual ego, I know, is a really big conversation, but to me, it's the most important way to end this conversation, because you are not a concept. Even your ideas of karma and your ideas of why you're here, and they're all concepts. They're all concepts. And I told you, I do acknowledge very powerfully that these are archetypes that can help us reach and hack into deeper states of understanding. But anytime you ever move into some form of blissful transcendental state or deep commune with the deity and the way that you perceive it, you will notice that no concepts can live in that realm. Linguistics, the more that your spirituality is based in linguistics, explaining layers and how things are, the more you're trying to grasp at intangibles, at wisps of smoke in infinity. And the spiritual ego is an absolutely fascinating thing. Does it try and convince you that you're a concept? I want you to really challenge yourself and ask you, does your spirituality come with many concepts that you feel most comfortable around if you are around other people that hold similar concepts? Does your spiritual framework or concept make you feel bigger or better in some way? Does it make you discount in some way the opinions of others as though they were simply not enlightened enough or informed enough to be able to yet see your perspective? These are very difficult questions for a true spiritual seeker to ask themselves. And I feel that only in the very, very dark nights of the soul, only in absolute desperation, where I had tried to solve it with my sciences and my mind and my reading and the fascinating thing about the mind is any book that's ever written about how to solve what's going on inside you was written by the mind. It's the mind trying to heal the mind. It's quite hysterical. But the spiritual ego and this world of concepts, I feel like I spent decades building up these concepts, and I still use concepts a lot because, like in shadow work, or gives you this idea of how to access something, but that's not necessarily how it is. It's just how it appears to this teeny little organism that has the small idea of how it is that I fit. And only when I started to release my concepts that I feel like I really, really started to have a very, very deep and safe experience in simple prayer. And it was almost in breaking one night, crying, so desperate that I just had tried to solve this problem so many times that instead of asking it to be taken away, I simply said that I cannot change this, I cannot fix this. And I'm going to stop punishing myself, and I'm going to stop secretly believing that I've done something wrong, and I'm just literally going to surrender into the perfection of what I'm experiencing. And although, once again, what I experienced was so difficult, in the back I had this incredible peace of the fact that I had accepted that I was not a being of domination and control of my environment, that I accepted that what was dealt to me and what is held by me right now is a part of the most epic pattern of purpose and existence that I could ever conceive, and that I can only surrender into the absolute simplicity of it, tearing all my garments of concepts aside so that I can go and kneel. And I hope that this is very challenging for you. I hope that it's challenging enough for you to ask yourself, are you possessed by concepts? Are you invaded by the mind's version of the simplicity of divine surrender? Are you so lost building castles in the sky, not realizing that the only path to pure compassion is one free of thought or opinion or left or right, or there is the sacred chamber within your heart that can be accessed in an absolute instant? You just surrender. You surrender knowing. You surrender understanding. You surrender control. And this is something that the spiritual ego will not allow you to do. And these castles that we build in the sky, these thought palaces, that spirituality is absolutely drowning in, almost trick us to thinking that when we close our eyes, that we are going directly online. And how would you know if you are? Well, first of all, I can only speak from my perspective. I have no idea what other people's experience of reality is. But I do know that once I identified that I was possessed by a spiritual ego, and once I could identify how it was working, when I closed my, and it still happens to me all the time, when I close my eyes, when I'm lost in concepts, immediately, if I close my eyes, and I'll tell you what I'm experiencing already, I have this idea now, there's something greater than me that I must connect to. I am something that I shouldn't be. I've got these feelings of what I should become and how I can purify myself. So actually, I'm filled with concepts. And what happens is there's so much noise in there that I'm essentially actually trying to tell spirit what needs to be done through my concepts, which completely hijacks us from ever opening our eyes and actually going, okay, well, I feel a lot better because I meditated, but actually I'm still terrified because you still think that thing is your responsibility. And I'm not talking about things, you know the saying, know the things I cannot change and surrender to them, but have the strength to change the things that I can. So I think it's a very powerful place for us to finish. The spiritual ego. I have such difficulty at the moment, and it's not because I am enlightened by any means. I am at such war with this inner dialogue and this inner spiritual ego that I've got to the point where I find it difficult to be around people that I used to think were very, very spiritual, because if they start invading me with spiritual concept and telling me how it is, and I find I'm so busy trying to clear out all the ones I constructed inside me that I feel I'm invaded from both sides, and I end up withdrawing more and more into isolation. And it's honestly just for mental health and because of the clarity that I feel when I can go onto my hands and knees. And for some reason, perhaps because it was placed into me as a child, surrender into things and just begin to pray. I can't tell you what to pray, I can't tell you how to pray. I'm hoping that this conversation has stimulated you in some way to find what I have found. And it is just such a beautiful thing to really not conceptualize, because there is no safety in that. I know with every part of my being that I'm just surrendering into this thing that's greater than me. And I know that I'm part of something greater. And sometimes it's just very difficult for me to get on board of the little things and the big things that I have to face along the way. You know, fundamentally, I think one of the most important conversations that one could ever have is the conversation of how chaos and perfection are so tightly wound together. You know, we spoke about this ocean earlier. If you were to be on the beach in this mighty storm, you would see such chaos. You'd be convinced that the true nature of the beach is chaos. But if you could just pull back and look at the ocean as a whole, you would see that there's some beaches where things are perfectly calm. There's a dolphin being born just down the way, and there's this perfect balance of this biosphere that takes place. So actually, chaos is just the inability to see the whole picture. That is one of the most important concepts that I needed. Because remember, I said that these ideas, they can serve us to climb up to this altar of my inner being, where I could in prayer find the courage to finally let go of what I thought I knew, so that I could just dive into the abyss. And it comes down to the fact that we often do believe that chaos exists. You know, if you can imagine watching a star collapsing, one would think, what chaos, but then pulling back and seeing the perfect symmetry and the perfect movement that all the planets are harnessing the entire galaxy. I want you to consider in your life right now, no matter what you're dealing with, that all chaos is framed in perfection, that is then again framed in chaos, that is then framed again in perfection. What an incredible thing to meditate on. Just, just, just observe, for instance, how a biosphere keeps itself balanced. But if you were to be the impala that was caught by the leopard, you would be in that moment so into that chaos, that absolute unfolding. But if you just pull back a little bit, that leopard is part of a life cycle so much greater, and that impala. So I hope I've left you with some interesting thoughts for your own contemplation. I want you to contemplate the spiritual ego and the fact that we are so obsessed with concepts. I want you to meditate on whether you truly believe that the divine emanation of true reality can ever be harnessed linguistically. And is it possible that we're so busy filling ourselves in how empty and scared and lost we feel with more and more spiritual ideas, to the point that it's getting pretty loud in there, that when we close our eyes and we try to enter the temple, that it's hard for us to go through the eye of the needle. And that perhaps, as Adyashanti suggested, that enlightenment is a destructive process, a tearing back of everything that you've learned. We need to just begin to glimpse how, where we once gave up prayer in its absolute innocence and childhood simplicity, we found a glimpse of the divine and used it to build castles in the sky, to the point where we are absolutely enamored with so many concepts and ideas and beliefs and mental structures that we are battling to even get on with each other. We can't find enough room for all the mind in here and around. And that perhaps Another stage that we go through is we begin to strip it back again and quiet, move into quietudes of where perhaps even the deeper level of the divine that you are resides. Either way, I invite you to this evening or to next time you have some problem upon your plate, next time you're part of a pattern of resistance and pain, I invite you to close your eyes and begin this deep conversation with yourself of what would it be for my life to truly tap into the power of prayer.